At 20 to 43 in the narrow waters off the Koshiki Strait, the sea looked like a sheet of crumpled black steel. The wind came low and wet from the southwest, carrying the stink of fuel oil and coal smoke long before the lookouts could see the shapes on the horizon. On the open bridge of the submarine Tang, a 33-year-old commander named Richard O'Kane stood with his hands welded to a pair of salt-stained binoculars, eyes burning from exhaustion and spray, watching ghostly smudges grow into the outlines of ships. Somewhere out there, in that wavering darkness, waited a convoy that could make or break his patrol. He could feel the boat's deck flex under his boots as the bow rose and fell through the swells. Men moved quietly behind him, silhouettes at their stations. Report after report drifted up from the control room below, course changes, bearing updates, speed estimates. Each fragment of information slid into place inside his head, assembling into a picture more vivid than the darkness in front of him. 6 large merchant hulls, heavily loaded, a ring of escorts pacing like guard dogs, and a shallow, constricted sea that left him almost nowhere to hide if something went wrong. Behind the steel of his expression, a sentence still echoed from months before, tossed like an insult in a wardroom far from the front. They called his submarine dead on arrival. A nice new hull, men had said, a fine new crew, and torpedoes that turned all of that into a metal coffin waiting for its own funeral. It had been a joke then, the kind men told to keep their hands from shaking. Standing here now, with enemy silhouettes swelling on the horizon and his own tubes full of weapons with a history of failure, the joke felt like a curse. Richard O'Kane had not been born to accept curses. He was a career naval officer, son of New England, schooled in engineering and trained to believe that numbers, angles, and discipline could tame chaos. Before the war, he had known steel and equations more intimately than he knew people. On boats like the Wahoo, he had learned to think in 3 dimensions: depth, speed, bearing, and to turn that thinking into cold, efficient violence. He had also learned what it meant to lose a submarine and everyone aboard it, to live with the knowledge that he walked the pier while others did not. Beneath the surface of his poise, that loss gnawed at him still. He carried it into every patrol, into every attack solution, into every decision that placed his crew between survival and oblivion. Tonight was no different. If anything, the weight felt heavier. Because tonight he was about to gamble not only with his own life and those of his men, but with the very reputation of this strange, compact killer he commanded. Either Tang would become another name whispered in mess halls as a story of waste and bad luck, or it would prove that even cursed torpedoes could be bent by stubborn human will. A lookout's voice snapped from the darkness, tight with tension. New shape, bearing off the starboard bow. Slight mast, small hull, moving fast. Another escort. The narrow sea that already felt crowded now seemed to close in like a vice. He lowered the binoculars, eyes narrowing as he imagined the rings of steel had merchants in the middle, escorts on the flanks, all of them separated by distances he had to feel more than see. "Keep your eyes on the big ones," he said quietly, more to himself than to the men beside him. "The little ones only matter after we fire." He left the bridge with a last glance at the dark horizon, ducking into the narrow tower that led down into the control room. The change hit him like a wave. Outside there was wind and spray and the wide, empty night. Inside was light, heat, and cramped urgency. Men bent over plotting tables and instruments, faces lit by red lamps. Voices were low and quick, the language of bearings, speeds, estimated ranges, the heartbeat of a hunting submarine. He moved to the attack center almost without thinking, taking his position by the plotting table. The picture of the convoy took shape in greased pencil strokes on the chart. Streaks of ink marking the predicted path of each ship, little circles indicating positions over time, a spider web of motion and timing. His executive officer, lean and focused, passed him the latest estimates. Merchant speed, escort pattern, distance to the head of the column. None of it was perfect, it never was, but perfection was a luxury for people on land. Submarine commanders lived with margins, uncertainties measured in seconds and yards, and the thickness of a ship's hull. He traced the projected path of 2 of the largest ships with the tip of his finger. They were carrying something important: oil, troops, equipment, food. The specifics did not matter to him in this moment. What mattered was that their sinking would starve something farther up the chain of command. A front would slow. A garrison would weaken. Somewhere, months from now, Men he would never meet might live longer because of what he did tonight. But the route to that outcome ran through the tubes in the forward room and the flawed pieces of engineering slumbering inside them. Torpedoes with a history of running too deep, of failing to detonate when they struck, of exploding prematurely and warning the enemy before they could do real damage. He had seen it. He had felt the sick, cold drop in his stomach as perfect attacks turned into cascades of failure. He had heard the stories of men court-martialed not for cowardice, but for daring to criticize the weapons they were forced to trust. That was why they had called his boat dead on arrival. Not because of the steel of Tang itself, but because of the invisible component in every attack, the gamble that the things fired in anger would perform as designed. He inhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. Tonight, the gamble would be his, not the torpedoes. If he chose the right angles, the right moment, the right path into the enemy formation, he could turn uncertain weapons into a storm no convoy commander could have anticipated. "Bring us 10 degrees to port," he ordered quietly. "Match speed on the column. I want us pacing them like we belong there." The helmsman repeated the order, hands firm on the wheels. The boat responded, steel and machinery translating intention into motion. O'Kane pictured Tang from above, a low, dark shape slipping alongside the flank of the convoy, just outside the perimeter that the escorts believed was safe. In the doctrine he had studied, submarines stayed back, fired from range, then dove deep to escape. In the doctrine he had helped shape in combat, submarines became something else at night, wolves running on the surface among their prey, indistinguishable until it was too late. The idea still ran against the instincts of many. Submerged to be safe, surface to be seen, but he had learned that at night, with careful approach and disciplined use of silhouette, a surface submarine could be harder to spot than a periscope wake. And from the surface, his torpedoes would run truer. His own eyes could judge the dance of ships more reliably than the distorted view through a scope. As Tang slid into position, he allowed his mind to slip, briefly, into the past. The memory came with the smell of paint and new metal. The day Tang had first taken the water, dressed in flags, deck crowded with officers and visitors. Cameras, handshakes, speeches about duty and destiny. He had stood at attention, crisp uniform pressed, knowing that beneath the formality lay a simple truth. All that ceremony meant nothing if the systems below decks failed where it counted. Days later, during trials, they had tested the boat's ability to dive, to turn, to endure. Depth charges were simulated, emergency drills run until every man could scramble to his station in the dark with his eyes closed. On paper, Tang was as ready as engineering could make her. But nothing on paper could erase the stories already circulating in hushed voices in the submarine force. Stories of Mark 14 torpedoes that should have broken enemy hulls like eggshells, but instead had slammed into steel and bounced away with harmless thuds. Stories of torpedoes that dove beneath targets, never to be seen again, or that exploded halfway to the enemy, throwing up fountains of water that might as well have been flares announcing the submarine's position. Commanders had complained. Investigations had stalled. Too many careers were tied to the promise of a perfect weapon. One evening, in a crowded wardroom where cigarette smoke hung under low lights like fog, another officer had clapped him on the shoulder and laughed with a tight edge. "Congratulations, you got the newest coffin," the man had said. "Dead on arrival. That is what they will call her if those torpedoes do not learn how to behave." Men had chuckled, uncomfortable, eyes sliding away. O'Kane had smiled thinly, not trusting himself to answer. Inside, something cold had set. He had carried that coldness forward into early patrols, into the first real attacks Tang made in hostile waters. He remembered one in particular with painful clarity. A cargo ship, big and fat on the horizon, escorted by a single destroyer, perfect setup. He had approached with textbook precision, close to ideal range, and fired a carefully spaced spread. Every calculation had been correct, every part of his human approach had been flawless. And yet the sea had answered with 2 premature flashes and 1 torpedo that struck with a hollow clang and failed to explode. Within minutes, the destroyer had been on them like an avenging spirit, roaring overhead, dropping charges in patterns that bracketed the submarine and squeezed the hull with brutal hands. In the darkness and chaos and hammering concussion, he had felt not just fear for his life, but a white-hot humiliation. He had done everything right. The men around him had done everything right. and the universe had shrugged. When they finally slipped away, battered but alive, he had gone to his tiny cabin and stared at the narrow bulkhead for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of the boat settling into routine again. It was then that the phrase "dead on arrival" had come back to him, not as a joke, but as a warning. If he let the unreliability of his torpedoes dictate his actions, then the label would become reality. Tang would never be more than a floating risk, a place where men waited to see whether fate liked them. He had decided, in that small cabin, that he would force fate into a corner instead. He would change the odds not by trusting the weapons more, but by shaping the battles so that even partial success could have disproportionate effect. That decision had led him, step by step, to nights like this one. A murmur rose from the sonar station, bringing him back into the present. He moved across the control room, the deck tilting gently under his feet, and leaned toward the operator. Headphones clamped over the young man's ears, eyes closed as he listened to the layered symphony of screws and machinery in the water outside. "Report," O'Kane said. "Multiple screws bearing green 180 to green 200, sir," the operator replied softly. "Fast propellers, likely escorts. Slow, heavy screws bearing green 150 through red 100. Convoy main body. They are all around us now, all around us." Tang was no longer stalking from a distance. She was sliding into the very heart of the formation, threading the spaces between columns of steel. The narrow seas left the enemy little room to maneuver, but they also left him little space to escape. The same geography that made this attack so potentially devastating also made any mistake potentially fatal. He let the picture settle in his mind, building it out of sound, chart marks, and his own experience. Then he moved back to the plotting table and began to work through the solution for the attack that had been forming in him for hours. Tradition suggested he should choose one ship, maybe two, and expend a conservative number of torpedoes on each, accepting that some would fail and that the rest might cripple but not sink. Prudence whispered that he should take what the night offered: a pair of kills, a safe withdrawal and live to fight again. Somewhere deeper, a different voice murmured about opportunity, about the kind of blow that echoed up through the layers of war. He spoke quietly to the officer of the deck, to the fire control team, to the men whose hands would literally touch the levers that unleashed his decisions. "We are not here to scratch paint," he said. "We are here to break backs." On the chart, he drew a line that cut through the paths of two large ships. Then another line, offset, aimed slightly farther along the convoy's track. With careful spacing, the torpedoes could cross the convoy's path at different points, each with a chance to find steel. The enemy would be moving. The night would hide exact shapes. His own view would be limited. Much of this would be done almost blind, relying on predicted positions rather than clearly seen hulls. It was insane by the standards of safer men, but he had not been sent here to be safe. The plan settled into place like a final piece of machinery locking home. He felt the familiar stillness inside that always came just before he committed to action. Doubt did not disappear. It never did. It simply became part of the landscape through which he moved. He stepped closer to the periscope well but kept it lowered. There would be time later for a brief, confirming sweep. For now, he trusted his plotting more than any brief glimpse could offer. At night, he allied more often than the mathematics. "Match their speed exactly," he ordered. "Hold us just outside the escorts. I want us to look, on the surface of the water, like we belong in this mess." The helmsman adjusted. The engines thrummed. The men at the depth gauges watched the needles hover. The boat became an arrow waiting to be loosed. In the forward torpedo room, men sweated over metal, checking seals and connections for the 10th time. The weapons inside the tubes were silent and cold, but in the minds of the crew they were already roaring through black water. Each man carried his own private version of the same question. Would they finally behave as advertised tonight, or would they once again betray the hands that launched them? One of the younger torpedomen, pale and sharp-faced, glanced at an older petty officer as they waited for the order. "Do you think they will work this time?" he whispered. The older man looked at him for a long moment, eyes tired. Then he shrugged. "They will either work," he said quietly, "or we will not be around long enough to complain." On the control room deck above, O'Kane could not hear that exchange, but he would have recognized the sentiment. He had thought it himself more times than he cared to admit. For a heartbeat he considered calling down, saying something to his men to cut the tension. Some commanders like to crack jokes, to pretend that nothing truly bad could happen under their watch. He was not one of them. Comforting lies sat pearly in his mouth. The best gift he could offer them was competence, not false confidence. Still, the knowledge that those faces, those lives, hung on his next decisions sharpened everything. Every bearing, every angle, every second he allowed their boat to remain vulnerable on the surface. Outside, unseen in the dark, the convoy continued its steady plodding through narrow waters that had suddenly become far more dangerous than its officers realized. Inside Tang, a commander who had been told that his boat was dead on arrival prepared to prove, for at least one night, that the only thing dead in these seas would be the certainty of his enemies. The convoy crept forward, blind in its own certainty. On their bridges, enemy officers trusted in numbers, in escorts, in the darkness itself. Inside the submarine slipping at their flank, Richard O'Kane trusted only in the thin thread of calculation that separated brilliance from disaster. "Time thin to a wire, stand by to come left," he said quietly. "We are going to cut in." The order moved through the control room like a current. Hands tightened, eyes flicked to gauges. The helmsman's knuckles went pale as he eased the wheels. Tang began to edge inward, shaving distance between her and the invisible wall of safety the escorts believed they had drawn around the convoy. The boat's bow nosed toward the convoy's heart, her low deck a smear of shadow on a sea already black. He felt the moment when they crossed an invisible boundary, some inner line between stalking and committing. The hair on his neck prickled. The noise picture shifted. The heavy, slow thud of merchant screws grew louder in the water, layered with the higher, faster beat of escorts whose courses overlapped like blades in motion. "Range to lead merchant?" he asked. The answer came almost instantly from the fire control team, eyes fixed on their dials and plotting tables. Estimates, always estimates, but estimates sharpened by countless nights and by his own ability to feel the geometry of the battle. He nodded once, as if answering a private question. "All ahead standard," he ordered. "Match them exactly." "We go in with them, not at them." The submarine surged, just enough to keep station. In his mind's eye, he saw Tang as a shadow running along the convoy's column, nearly parallel, waiting for the right angle to slide across its path like a knife. He went to the periscope at last, not to live in it, not tonight, but to confirm the ghosts he had been chasing with numbers. The scope rose with a hiss, metal sliding through water, then locked. He snapped it up fast, spun it once in a smooth, economical arc. Thin streaks of light, hulking masses darker than the night behind them, dim points from shielded portholes. A forest of masts and funnels, the pale sliver of a destroyer's bow knifing through the sea, far too close for comfort. Down scope, the instrument slipped back into its well, and he exhaled. The picture in his head was now complete enough. He moved to the attack director, hands steady. "We are going to fire 6, he said, voice level. 2 aimed at the big fellow forward of the convoy center. 2 at the one behind him, 2 more staggered, spread along their track. I do not want a tidy battle line. I want chaos." The men around him absorbed this without outward reaction. They knew what 6 torpedoes meant. They knew how many they carried, how many other chances the war might offer on this patrol. To fire so many in one engagement was to bet hard. To fire them in a pattern designed to reach beyond to targets and into the realm of chance was to stack that bet higher still. But they also knew who stood at the center of the control room. This was not a man given to wasting shots out of pride. If he chose to risk so much, it was because some inner calculus told him that tonight demanded nothing less. He gave final corrections in a low, even tone. Course adjustments measured in degrees, speed estimates sanded smooth by intuition. Torpedo depth settings deep enough to bite into the bellies of heavily laden hulls, shallow enough to function within the treacherous envelope of the weapons they had been given. In the torpedo room, the order came crackling through, "Stand by, troops 1 through 6 ready." Men checked latches, felt for the faintest give-in seals, wiped sweating palms on their uniforms. They lived now in a world the size of their own breathing, their thoughts narrowed to the instant of release. A thin silence settled over Tang. Not a true quiet, the boat still hummed with machinery, whispered with metal, sighed with air, but a focused hush, as if even the steel was holding its breath. Open outer doors, O'Kane said calmly. The words moved like a spell. Outside, in the dark water, the heavy external doors swung wide, exposing the mouths of the tubes to the sea. One more line cut between safety and irrevocability. He watched the sweep of the clock. He watched the notations on the plot. He listened, always listened, to the drone of screws, the murmur of bearings. Everything converged on a single span of seconds. Not yet. Not yet. Now. Tube 1. Fire. The boat shivered, a subtle lurch as the first torpedo spat forward, compressed air hurling steel into the black. Men felt it in their bones more than their feet. Someone whispered a number under his breath, beginning an invisible count. Tube 2. Fire. Another shudder, another weapon tearing itself free into the dark. O'Kane's mind traced their arcs as clean white lines on an unseen chart, fanning out toward the projected positions of ships that would not know they were marked for death until it was far too late. Tube 3. Fire. Each command was clipped, almost gentle. There was no need to shout. The weight in the room was beyond volume. Tube 4. Fire. He waited fractions of seconds between each order, tiny spaces that allowed the pattern to widen, to breathe. His attack was not a single punch, but a sequence of blows that he hoped would fall just out of phase enough to compound confusion. Tube 5. Fire. In the torpedo room, the men worked like parts of a machine, eyes tight, jaws tense. They could imagine the long, lean forms knifing forward, propellers biting, gyros steering toward coordinates scribbled on paper a deck above. Tube 6. Fire. Then it was done. 6 shots loosed. 6 futures arcing out into the sea. The control room was suddenly full of nothing but waiting. No one spoke. No one moved without necessity. O'Kane stood near the plot, his gaze flicking between the chart, the time, the sonar operator. Inside, he kept a separate count, every heartbeat another yard in his imagination. The first torpedo, by his calculation, would reach its target in less than a minute. A short eternity. In that suspended space, memories threatened to intrude. The hollow thunks of duds, the ugly white splashes of premature detonations, the sick lurch in his own gut when an attack had gone sideways for reasons beyond human skill. He walled them off with effort, forcing his mind to stay here, in this moment, with the metal and water and geometry he could still influence. The sonar man's face tightened, his fingers twitched against the casing of his equipment. "Louder screws, sir," he murmured. "One of the big ones is increasing revolutions. Maybe they smell something." Of course they did. Even in darkness, even in cramped waters, instincts evolved. Some officer out there might have caught a glimpse of an odd wake, a strange silhouette. Some man on some deck might have felt a shift in the night's pattern and shouted a warning. It did not matter now. The dice were already rolling through the black, seconds drained. Then, a distant, muffled thump rolled through the sea, so low at first that some men thought they had imagined it. The deck trembled with a faint, delayed vibration. Somewhere out in the dark, water and steel had collided in rage. Then another, sharper, closer rumble. 2 explosions. The sonar operator breathed. Bearing near our starboard bow, heavy, the air in the control room seemed to thicken. Eyes darted, not to each other, but to the captain. He did not move, save for a tightening of his jaw. The third blast came like a hammer blow on the hull of the World. The deck jolted. Instruments rattled. Men grabbed for handholds. This one was closer, and far larger. For an instant, O'Kane pictured an enormous ship's back snapping, plates buckling, boilers ripping free. Before the echoes could die, a 4th detonation slammed through the water. This one from a different bearing, different range. Not a single hull breaking under multiple hits, but at least 2, maybe 3, torn open in staggered agony. The control room erupted in a low, uncontrolled murmur, half disbelief, half exultation, held in check by the knowledge that they were still exposed. The convoy had just been transformed from an orderly procession into a stumbling mass of wounded giants, and Tang was in among their feet. "Hold your stations," O'Kane snapped, not unkindly. "We are not out of this yet." Outside, the night had been ripped wide. Sheets of fire licked skyward where fuel or cargo had ignited. Shadows of listing hulls loomed and vanished. The sharp, stuttering flashes of gunfire flared as escorts began to fire at phantoms, their crews desperate to shoot at something, anything. On Tang's bridge, Men squinted against the intermittent glare as the submarine sliced through seas that suddenly boiled with panic. A listing merchant loomed off the beam, bow down, screws thrashing wildly as it fought to keep some kind of steerage. Another farther off was already rolling, a long, agonized lean that would end only when its center of gravity surrendered to the flood in its lower decks. Sirens wailed. Voices in a foreign tongue carried thinly over the water, high and raw in the intervals between detonations. Down below, the sound picked up by sonar turned into chaos. Screws sped up, slowed, changed direction unpredictably. Metal screamed as ships scraped past one another in blind attempts to evade. Somewhere, a destroyer swung too hard and had to check its turn, engines roaring to avoid colliding with the very ships it was meant to protect. O'Kane saw a shape loom and vanish at the edge of vision through the bridge glass, a destroyer's bow, brutally close. For a sickening instant he imagined the knife-edged prow plowing into Tang's flank, cutting through their thin-pressure hull as if it were paper. Left full rudder, he ordered sharply, "Bring us around. We are leaving this party before the hosts remember to look down." The helmsman obeyed. The submarine swung, turning her bow away from the convoy's heart and toward deeper, slightly freer water. It was not a run of cowardice, but a withdrawal time for survival. He had struck as deeply as any commander could have asked of himself and his crew. To linger now was to invite an answering blow from a foe that, though wounded, still had claws. "Prepare to dive," he called down. The order rippled through the boat. Men sealed hatches, checked valves, secured loose items. On the bridge, the last lookouts snatched final, flickering images of burning ships before dropping into the conning tower. The sea air, thick with smoke and the copper tang of violence, gave way to the closed, hot atmosphere of the submarine. Clear the bridge. Dive. Tang slipped beneath the surface, her hull briefly awash in the red reflections of distant fires before the sea swallowed her whole. Water roared over the deck, pressed against the steel, then muffled to a sullen wait as she descended. "Take her down to 90 feet, O'Kane said, voice calm again. "Level off and stand by for evasive." The boat angled downward. The bubbles of her passage streamed upward like a ghost's last breath. Darkness thickened outside, the dim, scattered light from above smearing into nothing. Inside, men watched depth gauges climb. 50, 70, 90. Tang steadied, suspended in cold blackness. Then the first pattern of depth charges began to fall. The sound started as distant thuds, like someone dropping heavy furniture on a ceiling far overhead. Each one was a note in a grim music that every submariner learned to read: distance, direction, intent. The closer they came, the more that music took bodily form, transmuting into jolts that slapped at the hull, rattled teeth, made lungs feel momentarily empty. "Escorts are angry," the sonar operator muttered, half to himself, half to the room. Multiple sources, one closing from starboard, one circling to port. "They are hunting. Let them hunt where we were," O'Kane said evenly. "Not where we are." He ordered a slow turn, altering Tang's course just enough to slip away from where the enemy believed they had last seen her. He reduced speed, letting the boat's noise blend into the background murmur of the sea. Fast runs made for quick moves, but they also drew listening ears like flares. The next set of charges fell closer. The concussions pounded through the water, slamming against the submarine skin. The deck jumped. A light bulb shattered with a brittle pop, glass raining down in tiny, glittering shards. Somewhere aft, a loose tool clanged to the deck and rolled before being snatched up by a cursing hand. One blast came so close that for an instant it felt as if the entire hull had been gripped by a giant fist and squeezed. The lights flickered, dust sifted from unseen corners. A crewman near the forward bulkhead flinched, his hand flying to the steel beside him as if to feel whether it still held. Water began to drip from a seam in a pipe run above the control room, fat drops splashing onto the deck. It was not a catastrophic leak, but in that moment any intrusion felt like the sea's first probing finger, testing for weakness. "Report damage," O'Kane snapped. Voices answered from compartments up and down the boat. "Minor. Superficial. No flooding beyond the small drip overhead. Systems intact." The words steadied everyone who heard them, though no one fully relaxed. Depth charges were fickle. The next might be closer. Or someone might get lucky with a pattern. "Hold her steady," he told the diving officer. "Do not let us porpoise." The last thing we need is to bob up into a better shot. The diving officer nodded, eyes on the angles. The crew obeyed with the kind of concentrated precision that only came when every man knew that an error of a few degrees meant death. The storm outside went on. Charge after charge hammered the water, some near, some far. The pattern of explosions became a kind of clock, measuring the enemy's anger and confusion. They were casting a wide net, dropping weapons along suspected tracks, perhaps guided by sonar returns that blurred together in the mess the convoy had become. Time stretched. After a while, the concussions grew more sporadic. Angry, sharp blasts gave way to more distant rumbles. The escorts were groping now, less sure of where the intruder might be. In the lulls between impacts, other sounds crept in through the hull. The groan of a distant ship breaking as its back gave way. The long, low scrape of something large sliding along the bottom or across another hull. The disorganized crash of collisions avoided too late. The war above was eating its own wounded. Inside Tang, sweat cooled on faces. Hands that had been clenched white around rails loosened a fraction. The tension did not vanish, it never did while a boat was under threat, but it shifted from white heat to a more bearable glow. O'Kane stood in the center of it all, eyes on nothing, seeing everything. He saw, in his mind, the convoy as it must look now. Burning wrecks, zigzagging survivors, escorts tearing around in tight circles, depth charges blossoming in pointless fury, where water already held nothing but bubbles and debris. He saw, somewhere in that mental picture, the path his boat had taken, a ghost thread weaving in and then out of the chaos. He also saw, superimposed over all of that, the faces of his men. He moved, deliberately, from station to station, a hand on his shoulder here, a brief word there, not speeches, not congratulations. Simple acknowledgments that each man had done his part and that, for the moment, they were still alive together. In the forward torpedo room, the young torpedoman who had asked his older shipmate whether the weapons would work sat with his back against a bulkhead, breathing hard, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. He looked up as the captain's head appeared in the hatchway. "How are those tubes?" O'Kane asked. "Empty, sir," the petty officer answered before the younger man could speak. "But they sent their message." A faint smile ghosted across the commander's face. "We will give you more words to load later," he said. "For now, keep the doors tight. I do not want the ocean inviting itself in." He moved on, leaving behind a half-dozen men who, for the first time since the attack began, let out short, shaky laughs. Eventually, after what felt like an entire separate lifetime, the last depth charges fell far enough away that they were more rumor than threat. The sea outside settled into a heavier, quieter presence. The sonar reports shifted from frantic updates about closing escorts to more measured notes about ships moving away, wounded hulls slowing, some stopping altogether. "Escorts are combing astern of the convoy now," the sonar man reported. "Their screws are moving off our bearing. They are hunting ghosts back there." "Good," O'Kane said softly. "Let them." He let Tang drift on her new course for a while longer, deep and slow, trailing the edges of the convulsion they had created. Somewhere above them rested the bones of ships that had been intact less than an hour before. Somewhere, hundreds of men thrashed in oil-slick water or clung to fragments of wreckage, calling out in languages that none of his crew understood. The submarine could do nothing for them. The war had not left room in his orders for mercy stops. His duty was to his own men, to the distant fronts that depended on convoys like this one being cut to pieces. Still, in the hush that followed the barrage, he found his thoughts slipping toward the men he had never seen. He had long since moved past the simplistic idea that every enemy sailor was a faceless villain. Years of watching ships die had stripped that comfort away. Beneath the flags and orders and ideologies, there were always human silhouettes bundled on decks, running for guns, clutching railings as their world turned sideways. He stared at a spot on the control room bulkhead for a long moment, seeing not metal, but water lit by fire. Then he pushed the image aside. He could carry its weight later. Right now, his crew needed him fully here. Hours later, when Tang finally rose to periscope depth to take a cautious look, the night had changed from black to a murky pre-dawn gray. Smoke smeared the horizon in thick strokes. Where there had been a coherent convoy, there was now a scatter of shapes. A burning hulk here, listing badly. Another almost gone, only the stern still visible above the waves. Farther off, plumes of black smudged the sky where oil fires still raged. He lifted the periscope in short, disciplined bursts, never giving any single direction more than a second or two. The glimpses he stole were enough. He could see at least 2 large ships dead or dying. One more sat motionless, likely mortally wounded. The escorts were farther off, their wakes cutting restless lines as they still searched for a submarine that had long since slipped from the kill zone. What he could not see, could not know in this moment, was the full tally of that night's work. Some ship might have staggered out of sight only to roll and sink minutes later. Another might limp toward a distant shore, only to drag itself onto a beach and die there. The ocean rarely surrendered certainty in real time. He lowered the scope and turned to his officers. "We are done here," he said simply. "The world will tell us later what we did. For now, we trust the sea to keep our secrets." Tang slid away, back into deeper water, leaving behind a scene that would be studied and argued over long after her own fate was sealed. Months afterwards, when reports were compiled from intercepted communications and captured records, the night in the Koshiki Strait would emerge as something close to legend. The tallies would show that in a single savage attack, in one blind strike launched largely on prediction and nerve, this compact submarine had sent 4 enemy ships to the bottom or left them gutted beyond salvation. The numbers would be impressive. Analysts would circle them on charts. Instructors in classrooms would point at them as examples of what daring and skill could do. War correspondents would turn them into carefully edited tales of valor and cold efficiency. But none of those later accounts would quite capture the way it had felt inside the steel cylinder where it had actually happened. They would not convey the ache in the shoulders of the man who had stood on the bridge in cold spray, or the private bargains the torpedomen had made with themselves as they stood by their tubes, or the taste of recycled air in the control room while water above exploded in convulsions of fury. Nor would they capture the other truth that gnawed quietly at Richard O'Kane even as medals and praise began to circle his name. He knew, better than anyone, that what had happened that night was not just the result of flawless professionalism. It had been a collision of preparation and luck so rare that no one could count on repeating it. One torpedo a little faster, one escort glancing in the right direction a few minutes earlier. One depth charge pattern laid just a bit closer and Tang might have ended her career in that very strait. Remembered not for kills in one strike, but as another note in a long list of submarines that never came home. In the quiet after the patrol, in a dockside barracks where the walls did not move and the floor did not tilt, he sat alone for a while and turned that thought over. His victories, that night and on others, had brought tangible results. They had choked supply lines, starved garrisons, shortened battles. They had also written a story around his boat and his name that made some men call him a genius and others whisper that he was too much in love with risk. He could not deny that they were right, at least in part. The same instincts that had driven him to press for maximum damage in the Koshiki Strait would, not long after, lead him to push his luck in another crowded sea, against another convoy, with torpedoes that still carried quirks and curses. On that later night, the ocean's patience would end. A weapon meant for the enemy would curve back to bite its own. The boat that had once been mocked as dead on arrival would finally earn the title in the bluntest possible way. He would survive that catastrophe. Many of his men would not. He would endure captivity and return to a world eager to raise him on a pedestal for the tonnage sunk under his command. He would accept the honors not for himself, but for the crews who had walked every step of that narrow path with him. In lectures and interviews after the war, when asked about that for-ship night, he would speak of training, of doctrine, of the value of aggressive tactics properly applied. He would say less about the sick knot in his stomach when the depth charges had marched toward his hull, or about the faces that still visited him in the dark hours between sleep and dawn. History, as always, would reduce the story to clean lines. A submarine once dismissed as doomed, torpedoes with reputations for failure. A commander who refused to accept that verdict and instead carved his own line through the war, leaving wreckage in his wake. A single attack in a narrow sea, where 6 shots fired almost blindly tore for warships from the enemy's order of battle. What the neat summaries could never fully contain was the simple, heavy fact that none of it had been inevitable. It had been carried out by human beings, fallible and frightened, who chose to move forward anyway. And that, in the end, was the quiet truth that lingered long after the echoes of explosions had faded. Deep beneath the statistics and diagrams, beneath the debates about weapons and tactics, the story of Tang in the Koshiki Strait remained what it had always been in the moment it was lived. A night when a small group of men, told in advance that their boat was as good as dead, drove her straight into the dark between enemies and forced the sea itself to reconsider its verdict. They were not gods. They were not demons. They were simply sailors and officers who had accepted that courage did not erase fear, it carried it. The ocean took its due from them, as it always does from those who dare it. Some paid early, some paid late, some paid in memory that never let go. Yet as long as their story is told, as long as the image survives of that low, dark hull sliding alongside an unsuspecting convoy and turning flawed torpedoes into a storm no one saw coming, the label that once clung to their submarine curls and peels away. Dead on arrival. For one night, in a narrow strait half a world from home, they proved instead that even a boat given up as doomed could write itself a page in history with stubborn ink, and in remembering them not just as tonnage, not just as numbers, but as voices and hands and eyes in the dark. Those who lived in calmer times keep a small promise to men who went into the sea knowing that it might not give them back. If this story reached you, if you felt the steel deck under their boots and the weight of their choices in that narrow sea, take a moment to keep their memory moving. Share this tale with someone who cares about the hidden corners of World War II. Leave your thoughts and stories in the comments, and consider subscribing to help keep these quiet, human histories alive. A simple like, a word, a share each is another small echo that says their courage was not, after all, dead on arrival.